Hey everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. We are in Genesis, back in Genesis yet again. And so, first 11 chapters, 4 events. Next, however many chapters, 12 through 50, is 4 people. And so we are in that transition period where we're going from the big events into the people. Specifically, we talked about this last week. I think this is important to highlight again. We oftentimes categorize it 4 events, 4 people. I think that's really good, really useful. But at the same time, those things are linked together. It's not like the story just like restarts and like it's not connected whatsoever. What was happening in chapter 11 was the kingdom of Babylon was being introduced. Babel, same word. And so this kingdom of Babylon is being introduced, this kingdom whose leader is the rebel. It's this rebellious kingdom that's against God, against him, and trying to be self-sufficient and trying to do things on their own and trying to build up to him, make a name for themselves. And what we see from this and what we see from these contrasting ideas in chapter 12 is that these two things are opposed to each other. The Tower of Babel, this kingdom of Babylon, and the kingdom of God, the people of God that started with Abraham. So you see differences like one rebels against God by settling, the other trusts God by going. One tries to make a name for themselves, God makes a name for Abraham. God judges the people of Babylon, God blesses Abraham and his family. The people of Babylon leave behind a pile of bricks, Abraham leaves behind an altar. And so you'll see some of those things as we go through this first section today, where we get this people of God being established. But I think an important question to answer before we get into this, and we get into like the history of the Israelite people, is like, why do we care? If we're just being honest, like if you ask me the history of some random country or people throughout history, maybe you care because you like history, and that's great. I like history. But overall, most people would say, I don't really care. It's just this random people somewhere, and so it's cool they have a history, but why does this matter to me? One, Christians are a spiritual Israel. So this is our history if we are Christians. And I think these two passages in Galatians 3 make that decently clear. You can cross-reference a variety of different verses, but here are a couple if you want to jot those down or look at them yourself. So if we are spiritual Israel, this matters to us because this is the story that leads up to us. This is our people's history that's culminating into Christianity and culminating into the full story of God. It shows how God interacts with his people. So if this is true, we are like Israel, and God is still God, then we're seeing the relationship he has with his people. How does God treat them? What does God care about? Does God care when people do this certain action? Does God bless and uplift this certain attitude? How does God really treat his people? Is he a God that's oppressive? Is he a God that holds them down? Or is he a God, as we'll see today, that looks out for the vulnerable and protects them and cares for them? And so this is going to be another lens that I think we should read these last chapters through. And then finally, but probably most importantly, is Jesus is completing the Israelite story. And so this is really important, and I think oftentimes overlooked. Jesus is not just, out of the blue. And it's not like, well, the Old Testament was useful in its time, and we can kind of just leave that behind. I remember I was in a coffee shop in Tampa when I lived there, and I was overhearing this conversation, and it was this local preacher. I didn't know him, like, it's not a guy I knew. And he was talking to a student, and he was like, yeah, man, you can basically just never read the Old Testament. Like, actually what he said. And he was like, you basically don't have to at all. Just read the New Testament. It's all that really matters. And I think that's really, really, really missing the big point, one of the huge points of who Jesus is. He is the culmination. He is fulfilling the Israelite history. He becomes what Israel is supposed to be. So Israel was supposed to be this light to the nations. It was supposed to be this nation that showed God to everyone else around them. It was supposed to be this perfect image bearer of God, but it failed. And it failed again, and it failed again, and it failed again, and again, and again. And then Jesus comes along, and he does this perfectly. And alongside of that, he's also fulfilling the Old Testament perfectly. And so, yes, there's passages like 2 Samuel 7, where David says, you're going to have a son that's going to sit on the throne. He's going to establish a kingdom that lasts forever. Like, that's Jesus. And you have passages we've already gone on in class today, where it's like, not today, but overall, in Genesis 3:15, where it's this offspring of the woman who's going to crush the seed of the serpent. And you're like, okay, that's Jesus. But overall, and I think Eric mentioned this in one of his sermons, Jesus just fulfills everything in the Old Testament. You could shadow Jesus in so many parts of the Old Testament. This is all pointing to him. And so as you're reading through the Old Testament in general, but as we're going through this class, I think this is an important part of why this matters. Israel matters because Jesus comes through Israel. Israel matters because Jesus is the perfect Israel. Israel matters because it's their history that's being fulfilled and the Son of God coming to earth and dying for man. Okay, does anyone have any thoughts or questions on that? I think that was important to go over, but we'll keep going with today's class. Awesome. All right, so this is the outline of today's class. We're going to see the call of Abram. He's not Abraham yet. He'll get there, but he's not there yet. So it's the call of Abram, and then after that, he fails, like pretty much immediately. And then Abram and his nephew, Lot, they go separate directions. And so those are the three stories we're going to go over today. We're probably going to read the first one and the last one and summarize the middle one. So let's start off reading this first story, verses 1 through 9 of chapter 12 of Genesis. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old, and he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions, and all that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At the time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel. Sorry, my glasses were whacked. And pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negeb. Sorry, reading. So you have this story, and you have Abram. He goes. And what we need to understand about Abram, and I think this is sometimes missed, and it's really cool, is Abram doesn't come from like a pew-sitting like family, to like categorize it that way. He doesn't come from like this established family that are followers of the Lord, and then like he goes. Not the situation. His family, actually, in Joshua 24, is described as serving other gods. Like his dad serves other gods that aren't God, Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so where Abram comes out of, and the direction that he's headed towards, is actually very unique for his situation. He's very set apart in this way, and he's starting something for his family. I think you can make an application that's very true, that God works through many different types of people from many different types of backgrounds. And some people have a background like Abram, and they come from a family that has served other gods or been part of other religions or maybe served God in a way that he hasn't wanted to be served. And that's where they come from. And they're still able to dedicate themselves to the Lord faithfully. And God is pleased with them, and God wants them to be a part of his people, be a part of spiritual Israel. And so this is a cool thing we see from the father of this great nation, of the people of Israel, is that he came from maybe a different background, as you could say. The second thing that I want to highlight is verse 1. This is kind of the classic like call of Abraham is like, go, and Abraham went. But I think it's like such an important like part of his story. Is he's told to go to this land that I will show you. And Hebrews 11 makes it pretty clear he does not know where he's going. Like it's not like God comes to him and he's like, okay, like here's the land, and you can like even see it. And I'll like take you there through a vision. And you're going to see how beautiful it is. And you're going to see how it's filled with like, all these cows. And it's going to be filled with this great pasture. And it's like, no, Abraham gets none of that. Like that's not his story whatsoever. He's just told, go. And he goes. And that's it. But alongside that, he gets his promises, of course. But I think I tried to say this last week. Epically failed, but I tried. We're going to try again. So what I said last week is you have this distinction between the Tower of Babel and the story of Abraham here. In the Tower of Babel, what people tried to do is they tried to build themselves up to God. That's not how God works. We see how God works in this story. God comes down to man. You can't save yourself. God comes down to man, but for some reason we think that's synonymous with not having to do anything else. And we see in the story of Abram that that's not synonymous. See, God comes down to Abram. The Lord said to Abram, that's how verse 1 starts. But at the same time, Abram still has responsibilities. Abram still has to be obedient to the Lord. When God says go, Abram still has to go. These things are not very different. Jesus came down, He died on a cross, He saved us. That doesn't mean that we don't have to do anything and be a part of that. Man and God work together. But the Lord takes this first step. The Lord came down. God came down here. God came down through Jesus. And so I wanted to kind of correct that a little bit. It was pretty rocky last time, but I hope that was helpful. If you have any further questions on that, we can talk after class. And there's this parallel. I think this is something that sometimes is not taken away as much as it should be. Is you see Abram here, and you see Abram doing like a great thing. And you're like looking at the story of the Bible, and you're like, yeah, like Abraham, like the father of Israel. And you're like, that was like a really cool guy I learned about in like Bible class as a kid, maybe. And then you like get to the Gospels, and you're like, this isn't exclusive to Abraham. You know, Jesus goes up to Peter. He says, follow me. And Peter drops his net, and he follows him. He says, James and John, follow me. And like he leaves their family and follows Jesus. And then you see in Mark chapter 10, when there's this rich young ruler, and he's like, hey, go sell all that you have and follow me. And then he doesn't do it. He fails. But you see that this is supposed to parallel the disciples of Jesus in the Gospels and how they're presented. Is this radical call that I'm going to follow you, and I'm going to put you above everything else in my life. This is not something that's exclusive to Abraham. Yes, maybe the path doesn't look the exact same, and it's not a one-for-one, but there's a general concept that underlies the story of Abraham that's true for everyone who's a part of Israel, spiritual Israel even, us today, that we need to be willing to do the radical things just like Abraham was. I like this quote. Abram must exchange the known for the unknown and find his reward in what he could not live to see, a great nation, and what was intangible, thy name, and what he would impart, a blessing. Abraham gives up the comfortable and the known, and he does that for something that he won't be able to really see, and it isn't really graspable, sure. And so our story models this in a lot of ways, and I think we need to look at it through that lens. Does anyone have any comments or thoughts on that before we keep going? Okay, great. Oh, Matt?
I find it interesting that he leaves everything that is familiar to him. Go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house. So it's like a triplet almost, that he's leaving all these things that are familiar to him. Even what you described in his gods, he was familiar with those type of pagan deities. He leaves everything that he knows to find things that are unknown, which fits well with that Kidner quote. And that's the same calling, like you've mentioned many times tonight. That's the same calling that we have today, is to leave everything and go and follow whatever God tells us to do.
And I think to do that, to choose that radical way, you have to see the value of what you're leaving and like as less valuable than what you're going to.
It's hard to do.
You're going into this relationship with the Lord and seeing that as more significant and more special. But like you're saying, yeah, hard to do, for sure. Rob?
God only wanted to pick someone to be the father of his nation, someone who would fully trust in him the same way Jesus picks his disciples. The foundation of his church were people that dropped everything and fully devoted themselves. Like the rich young ruler, if there was anything keeping them back even just a little bit, he didn't want them to be a part of that.
And that's interesting is in the same way he picks the 12 apostles, when you see the 12 apostles, they're not perfect people, especially at the beginning. and they grow a lot, and God develops and works with them a lot, patient with them a lot. And you see these guys that have anger issues that are like yelling at Samaritans, and you're like, ooh, that's not right. And then you see, a guy who denies Jesus 3 times, you're like, ooh, that's not right. You see a guy that's doubting Jesus, and you're like, And even a guy who betrays Jesus. And it's like, those are the people that God chose. And in the past, is he chose these people that were willing to radically follow him and dedicate themselves to them. That didn't make them faultless, especially in the beginning. God worked them, and they grew. And you see that even with this Abraham story. We're about to go over a story in just a little bit of Abraham. The next story is like a failure. And Abraham fails to have faith in God. But Abraham grows, and God works with him. And so that's very, I think, comforting in a way. But just the reality is there is that radical choice we have to make. But at the same time, God works with us in our imperfections and helps us to grow past them. We're going to keep going. This is something I want to highlight. I think it's really cool. The promises to Abraham, like land, seed, blessing, are direct contrasts and overcoming the curses we saw in Genesis 3. So, if you remember back in the curses that we see in Genesis 3, you have the ground that's cursed and this hard labor. And then that's contrasted with this land that I will show you that later on he expounds upon. But this land is even described in Exodus 3 as this land that's flowing with milk and honey. It's this just abundant land that has, bees in it, and it has cows in it, and like that's how you get milk and honey. Is you have to have this abundance in the land to produce those things, and so that's overcome. At the same time, there's pain in childbearing. But here we see that I will make you into a great nation. Physical death and spiritual death. So we see the separation from God when they have to leave the garden in 3:24, and then we see also the physical death come up in 3:17. And so we see that those are both a part of the curse as well. But through you, all the nations will be blessed. This again is a prophecy about Jesus. There's going to be one that comes through you that all the nations are blessed through. That Jesus is going to overcome all the curses, yes, but these specifically. He's going to overcome physical death, and he's going to overcome spiritual death. So I think this is really cool. I just wanted to bring it out because I hadn't noticed it. I think Eric brought it up to me. I'll give credit to him. He brought this up. The promises here are overcoming the curses. Keep going for sake of time. This is cool. His life's a chiastic structure. Those are cool. So 75 years, and then he goes 25 years until Isaac is born, and then 75 years until his death. And so maybe that's a good way to remember the life of Abraham. Okay, this part. I wanted to highlight this for just a second. Abraham doesn't just go solo. Maybe it would be easier if he did, honestly. If Abraham was 75 and he's just some bachelor, and he just goes off and follows God. But that's not his story. His story is he goes, and I can't imagine what this conversation would be like. He goes back to his tent. He's like, Sarai, God came to me. It's like, how'd that go? Well, he just came to me. What did he say? He told me to go. Where are we going? No idea, literally at all. But he told me to go. And so are we going? Yep, we're going. And then they go. And so that's the story. And it's to believe that, to have confidence in that, to encourage that, to follow that. I think one thing that we miss oftentimes is the heart of Sarai. And what a woman she was to encourage and be behind Abraham in this decision and to support him along the way. Both Abraham and Sarah have their flaws throughout the story of Genesis. They are not perfect people. They mess up. Both of them do. But, however, I think this is something to be modeled in families. I'm not a husband, and I'm not a wife, but I think this is something that we're supposed to see in this text, is encouraging and aiding your husbands to do hard things and participating in those hard things, especially when they're for the Lord. I'll say that. And I think on the flip side of that, you have Abraham, and he's making the spiritually beneficial hard decisions. Matt brought this out, but he leaves his family, he leaves generational wealth, he leaves comfort, his normal, he leaves safety, he leaves stability, and he does that all to serve the Lord. And I think as men, we're supposed to see something in this story to also be modeled. Sometimes there's hard decisions that are put in front of us, and sometimes it's worth doing even though we have to leave things of great value behind in the process. And we see that in Abraham, and I think that's something that we should strive to be, something that we should try to be. Yeah, I'll say that. And then you see him call upon the name of the Lord. We're going to see this twice in the chapters that we're talking about here. But we saw this back. And you remember the descendants of Seth, they're the ones who first started calling upon the name of the Lord. And this shows a dependency on the Lord, that I'm going to be fully entrusting in you in this process, and especially as you're going away from all those things, your family, your normal, your safety. It would be important to depend on the Lord in this process. And I think when we make hard decisions, spiritual hard decisions, especially, we need to have a dependency on the Lord that is also shown here with Abram. He goes into the Negeb. This is the Negeb. So hey Sarai, we're going. Where are we going? No idea, but I know where we start. This is where we start. Hard conversation with your wife. I couldn't imagine. And this is what he's going into. And so imagine he has this fertile land and this fertile home, and then it's we're following the Lord, the desert. And you're okay, that's hard. That's really hard. And we can make jokes about it, and I have. But that's difficult. It's you go into that trusting that the Lord has you, and you obey him. I'm not going to read that for sake of time. I want to ask these questions. What practical steps can we take in our personal lives, families, communities, to cultivate faith and obedience like Abraham and Sarah? I think I'm going to keep it to the first question. So what are practical steps we can take in our personal lives, etc., to have a faith and obedience like Abraham and Sarah?
We need to remind ourselves that God is faithful to his promises. So we do that by continually going to the Word and meditating on it.
Yes. I think one of the things that's helping Abraham in this process is the promises he starts with in chapter 12. And you see he doubts those sometimes. You see that he doubts it in 15 and 17, I believe, where he's having doubts, and he goes to the Lord because of these doubts. And the Lord reassures him and reiterates them. He does that at the end of chapter 13 when he makes another hard decision. And so you see these promises are something he's hanging on to in this meantime and through this journey. And I think that's something we have to hold on to, is the promises the Lord has given to us. Things like seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. Things that we need to hold on to, that the Lord has these I will statements throughout the Gospels and throughout what he says to us, and that we need to hold on to, of our forgiveness, things like I just said. And so good. What else?
Everything we've been given is a gift from God. So he didn't ask us to give it up just as he gifted it to us freely. All meant for his glory anyway.
Yes, I think that's a good mindset to have, and I think it helps us to be sacrificial, is understanding what we have is the Lord's, and so we're just giving back to the Lord what is already his. So really good comment. Any other thoughts? Great. Okay, so the failure of Abraham. Like I said, so introduced, Abraham doing great, going to the desert, super hard, and then he goes and he fails. So we have this first sentence. There's a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt. Not a good situation. So there's a theme of the Bible that Egypt represents false security. And so you have this in 2 Kings 18. I'll read it. Behold, you are trusting now in Egypt, that broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it. Such is the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who trust in him. So if I have a reed or a stick, and I whittle the end off, and then I put it on the ground, and it's when you see a movie and they step on a nail and it's cringes your entire body. It's that picture. And you put all your weight on it, it goes through your hand. It's not a good image. And that's what Egypt is it looks good. It looks like it can support you, but then you put your weight on it and it just goes through your hand. It's not a good idea, and we'll see it later on through the Genesis. You have Hagar, the Egyptian, You have Israel, who desires to go back to Egypt when they complain. I just wish I was back in Egypt. I just wish I was back in Egypt. And it's like, dude, don't you remember you were in slavery? And then Solomon and his alliance with Egypt. So he marries a lot of women. Yeah. But at the same time, one of the wives that's specifically mentioned is the daughter of Pharaoh. And one of the things he specifically does wrong, that's specifically said in Deuteronomy, do not do, was he got horses from Egypt. And it was just like started this whole chain ball of a mess. And then Judah's appeal to Egypt because of Syria. So basically Assyria's coming in to attack Judah, and they go, please rescue us, Egypt, and it does not turn out good for them. And then Israel takes refuge in Egypt after the fall of Jerusalem, and God judges Egypt because of that. And so it's just not a good situation. When you see them going into Egypt, just not a good idea. And so it starts off bad, but it continues to get even worse. So basically, Abraham has this great idea. Abraham's a great guy in a lot of ways, fails in others. And so he's like, okay, I know you're really beautiful. Mind you, she's 75 years old. Not 75, 65, at least 65 years old. And still beautiful. That's what the text says. So you can be 65 and beautiful, according to the Bible. That's true. And so she's a beautiful woman, and she's here. And then she says, okay, you're so beautiful, in fact, that I think they'll kill me in order to have you. And so he's like, just say you're my sister. And if you say you're my sister, it'll be fine. And so they go in, and he's like, hey, I'm Abraham's sister. And then the Pharaoh takes Sarah, and then just starts giving Abraham all these animals. Gives him sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, camels. And so he's like, okay, I'll take your sister and I'll give you a bunch of things. It's just not a good situation at all. And then the Lord comes into the picture, and he afflicts Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And so the Pharaoh goes to Abram and is like, dude, what did you do? You told me she was your sister. And he's like, yeah, she's my wife. And so he gives Sarai, his wife, back to Abram, and they go away. So look at verse 1 of chapter 13. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. So he does this thing where he acts sort of like Satan acts. It's just true. So I think I can say that. He uses these half-truths. So we find later on, because he does this again, he doesn't learn his lesson, he does this again. And so we find out that Sarah is technically his half-sister. That's true. So it's his half-sister, and so he's going in and he's being like, well, technically she is my sister, and so we're not technically lying. And so we can say this. And that's kind of his mindset going through this. But God doesn't look well upon the actions that he takes. He gives his wife away, and it just doesn't look good. I don't think anything happens, at least nothing happens in chapter 20. But just if he didn't do anything, imagine the conclusions of this is it kind of sounds like he's, prostituting his wife out. And so he's like, here's my wife, and you give me wealth. And it's like, how did you get from chapter 12 at the beginning to this point? What happened to where you just leaped down so far? But we see God, and this is something that I was talking about earlier. It's important to understand while you're reading the Old Testament the character of God. And sometimes we picture God in the Old Testament as this mean, brutal God. And God comes in the New Testament, he's this nice God. It's not how it works. We see the character of God in this story. When Abraham fails, and he gives his wife to the Pharaoh, more or less, God comes into the picture and he protects Sarah. He protects the vulnerable in this situation. And we'll see this again in the book of Genesis, where God goes out of his way to protect the vulnerable and those in need. He cares for them. And so he sees that Sarah is in this position, and you could maybe put some fault on her, but majority fault on Abraham. And he goes out of his way to take her out of this situation. Also, in a different way, God is protecting and looking out for Pharaoh. He's saying, you're innocent. You don't even know what you're doing is wrong, and you shouldn't be doing it. And so, yeah, I'm going to do this before you make a mistake and you make a sin against me. And so we see that God judges Egypt with plagues, and that starts this, which is really cool. This is shadowing overall the story of the Exodus. And so there's a famine that leads the people of God to Egypt. God sends plagues as judgment. They leave with a plunder from Egypt, and they have this exodus from Egypt into the wilderness. And so that's what we see in this story here, modeled out later on. Does anyone have any comments or questions about this story overall? Abraham's failure, what's going on here? Any thoughts? Cool. So this next part, and I kind of wanted to split class like this. We're going to stick a little more time on this part. So starting in verse 1 of chapter 13, we already read that. Starting verse 2, now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold, and he journeyed on from the Negeb as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made the altar at first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At the time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife among me and you, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go and take the right. Or if you take the right hand, I will go and take the left. Okay, so there's this situation that is in front of them. We're still seeing the effects of the curse. Although these promises of this land that seems to overcome the curses is promised, the curses are still in effect. There's this ground that can't support or sustain both of them at the same time. And so they have to part ways. We also see broken relationships and familial strife. And so you see between these herdsmen, there's these relationships with their butting heads. They can't even get along with each other. And so there's this choice that has to be made. You, Lot, you choose what you want to choose. If you choose left, I'll go right. If you choose right, I'll go left. I'm going to leave the choice up to you. So let's keep reading in verse 10. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look for the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled the oaks of Merom, and which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Okay, so there's this choice that's made, and it's given to Lot. What are the differences you see in the text between how Lot and Abram make this decision? So this decision of which way to go, what do you see as differences? You can just kind of call them out. Lot was given the choice, and that was very strange. Okay, so like Abraham, older of the two. The older had supremacy, had authority, eldership over the younger. So this choice would have been Abraham's to make, and Lot would have had to just settle with whatever choice Abraham makes. Abraham gives it over to Lot. Good. What else do you see?
Lot chooses greedily.
Greedily? Yes. He chooses for himself. So this choice is given, and so you see a distinction between these two attitudes. Abraham gives this choice over to Lot. You choose. And it's a humility thing. It's a humble thing that he's doing, giving this choice over. And at the same time, Lot says, okay, you're giving me the choice. I'm going to choose the best for myself. What else do you guys see?
Abraham's choice is to separate from his nephew.
And I think that's a trusting thing. We'll see later that Abraham kind of has this negotiation where he's like, were you really meaning like it's actually going to be one of my servants? And God's like, no, like actually a son. And so with Lot and him making this choice to separate, this is a choice that's showing a trust in the Lord. I'm going to trust in you and the promises you've made, and I'm going to send part of my people away from me. Good. I'm not going to try. So Lot makes this choice with his eyes. I think that's an important thing to highlight and to know here. He looks up, and how is this place that Lot chooses described in verse 10? Yeah, it's like the Garden of the Lord. It's like the Garden of Eden. It's also said to be like Egypt. And so what exactly does that mean? There's different interpretations of what exactly that means. But at the same time, I think what is happening here, let's throw this on the board. I think what is happening here is there's this imitation where Sodom and Gomorrah is at least part of the land that's being referred to here. And you'll see in your Revelation class, if Eric hasn't gotten to it yet, Satan likes to work in this way. Satan likes to work in almosts. And so the mark of the beast, 666. What is that almost? It's almost 777. 7 is the perfect number. Where does this mark of the beast go? On the forehead. Well, what does that sound like? Well, it really sounds like the seal that comes up earlier in the book. And that the seal that God puts on his people's forehead, that solidifies them as saved. There's also the beast's imagery. There's a beast that is slain and then almost seems to resurrect, just like Jesus does. And so how Satan likes to work is he likes to get like really close, but it's not the reality. And so I think what could be happening here with this imagery of it's like the garden of the Lord is that it appears this way, but in actuality it's not. And maybe a point to be made here is that you can try to build the garden for yourself. You can even think a place looks like the garden. But without the Lord being there, it's nothing like the garden. What makes the garden so significant is not just the beauty that it was, but it was that the Lord dwelt there with man. And so we see this place is not like that place. Also, we brought this up before, this direction that Lot goes. He goes east. I think I've said this in like 3 different classes, but it's a theme. If you see someone going east, probably not about to do a good thing. And so you see when they go outside of the garden, they're going east away from the presence of God. You see this when Cain, after he has his judgment, he goes east into the land of Nod. And the Tower of Babel, they migrate east and they build this tower. Here we see Lot going to Sodom and Gomorrah. It's this theme. I don't think it's like the Bible's anti-east and like we always have to go west. I don't think that's the point. The point is just saying this is kind of a trigger or a cue for the reader. What is about to happen or what is happening is not pleasing to the Lord and away from his presence. Also want to highlight Abraham here. It was brought up, this idea of this choice being brought and given to the younger. Abraham's being a peacemaker here, and he's being a humble peacemaker. And I think showing an attitude of what we should model as Christians is Abraham could have taken for himself, he could have lifted himself up, and even in this society, in this culture, it would have been the okay and fair thing to do. It wouldn't even been looked down upon. But that's not what he chose to do. And there might be situations that we're faced with where we can take for ourselves, and it might even be acceptable to like societal standards, but it doesn't mean that's the choice we should make. The choices that we should make are the ones that make peace and model this idea, this kingdom principle of the first will be last and the last will be first. So if we put ourselves to that place of servant and to that place of last, to that place of humility, God will lift us up in the process and exalt us. There's this quote, I really liked it. By faith he had already renounced everything he could afford to refresh the choice, and by faith he had opted for the unseen. He had no need to judge, as Lot did by the sight of his eyes. The sequel for both men is instructive. Lot, choosing the things that are seen, found them corrupt and insecure. Choosing selfishly, he was to grow even more isolated and unloved. Abram, on the other hand, found liberation. And so this is something that's super important to the idea that you brought out. If we think of the things that we have as they're the Lord's, and we're willing to give them up, the more times we make this choice, sometimes it can make it harder, but sometimes it can even make it easier. I've given up everything before for the Lord. I gave up that thing that was super important to me. And like, what's this? Okay, I gave up everything that was comfortable to me. I gave up my family. I gave up generational wealth. Sure, I'll live in this land for a couple years instead of that land. Like, what's it to me? Like, I've already given up so much. And so I think there's comfort in here, in this distinguishment, found that if we do what we're supposed to do and we trust in the Lord, our trust is able to continually grow and continually be a process. This is also, I think, supposed to be a growing moment for Abraham. And so you have this idea where he does something good, he fails, and then he does something good again. And maybe part of what's happening with Abraham is he's looking back to his Egypt decision, and he's saying, I trusted in Egypt, and I went to them for famine, and that was not something I should have done. And I understand that now, and so maybe I'm going to make a different choice and trust in the Lord this time. And so I think this is also supposed to be seen as a growth moment for him. This is important as well. God reiterates the promises to Abraham. And so you have all this land that you see, I will give to you. And he's like, basically do a 360. You look north, you look south, you look east, you look west. If you look at a direction, this land will be yours. And I promise you that. You've made the right decision here. You've been a humble servant and a peacemaker, and I appreciate that, and I see that. That's noticed. And so I'm going to reiterate these promises. And I'm going to kind of even broaden them. He broadens them a little bit. And then he goes and he says, I don't know why I said it like that. And he says, I will make your offspring as dust on the earth. If you can count the dust, and then he'll later on go, if you can count the stars, if you can count the sand on the seashore, if you can count these things that no one's able to count, then you can count the offsprings that I'll have from you. And again, what we see is he builds an altar to the Lord. Notice back in chapter 12, when Abraham goes, and look at verse 8. Verse 8 of chapter 12. For there he moved to the hill country in the east of Bethel and pitched his tent. So he pitches himself a tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And so we see this pattern start to develop where in chapter 12 he's calling on the name of the Lord, in 13:4 he's calling on the name of the Lord, in chapter 12 he's building an altar, and at the end of chapter 13 he's building an altar. We're seeing the character of the type of person that God chooses as his people, that God yokes himself with and partners with, is someone that acts like this, who is fully dependent on him, who's giving them her whole lives to him, who's building altars and places of worship in honor of him. But also, look at how verse 8 has this idea that's separate. This permanent structure he's leaving behind is not to the glory of himself. It's not like the Tower of Babel here, where they're establishing this huge tower and it's to make a name that's great for themselves. The thing he's leaving behind is an altar worshiping the Lord. And the thing that he's not leaving behind that you can kind of just close up and you can throw away is he pitches a tent for himself. The thing that is not significant, the thing that is not to be lifted up, is the thing that has to do with him. And I think this shows us an attitude we should have as the people of God. The things for us are not the significant things. The things that are for God are the significant things. Last question in the last couple minutes of class. How might Abram's contentment with God's promises influence the way we approach life's uncertainties? And so we see at the end of this, Abraham's kind of left in this uncertain place. You saw the picture of the desert earlier. He's back to the Negev. He's back to this desert. It's uncertain. I don't really know what's going to happen. I don't know really where God's going to take me, where I'm going to go. I don't really know how this journey is going to continue. I don't know what's going to happen in chapters 14 through the end of my story. But I trust in the Lord. What do you think this tells us in Abraham's contentment about how we should approach the uncertainties of life? Matt?
It's not specifically talking about his faith in following the land. It's more related to the promise through his son. But Romans 4 talks about no belief made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. He was fully convinced. And that's something that we need to know, is that God
Yes, I think that's a good note to end class on. Thank you for that, Matt. Appreciate you guys.